On August 26, 1346, two armies clashed in northern France. One was an unstoppable force, 70,000 strong, led by a mighty king. The other, a mere 10,000 men, worn and ragged, backed into a corner, desperate for survival. In just one day, this unlikely force would make history, in a way no one saw coming. The Battle of Crécy was more than just a victory, it was a turning point that shattered centuries-old military traditions. How did a handful of English soldiers decimate an army 5 times their size? And what role did a simple wooden bow play in their triumph? Chapter 1, The Lead-Up to Crécy. The year is 1346. England and France are locked in a brutal conflict known as the 100 Years' War. What started as a dispute over land and titles had escalated into a war that would last for over a century, a war that shaped the course of European history. King Edward III of England had embarked on a daring campaign in France. In July of 1346, he landed his army on the Cotentin Peninsula, launching a relentless campaign of destruction through northern France. His troops sacked towns, burned villages, and raided the richest lands of France, leaving devastation in their wake. Edward's goal was audacious, to weaken the French king, Philip VI, and force him into submission. But Philip wasn't about to sit idly by while his lands were ravaged. He called upon the might of France, assembling an army so vast that it seemed unbeatable. Philip's army was not just large, it was formidable, comprised of some of the best knights, mercenaries, and infantry in Europe. The French king believed that his overwhelming numbers would crush Edward's army and end the English threat once and for all. But Edward III had other plans. As the French forces advanced, he led his troops north, hoping to link up with Flemish allies. However, when the Flemish failed to arrive, Edward was left isolated and outnumbered. The English king had no choice but to stand and fight. Chapter 2, The Setup, Edward's Bold Move. August 26, 1346. The English army was cornered near the small town of Crécy-en-Ponthieu. They were tired, hungry, and running out of supplies. But Edward had one advantage left, his tactical genius. Instead of retreating, Edward chose to stand his ground. He positioned his army on a hill, a strategic location that would give his forces the high ground. His men dug pits and set traps to slow down the inevitable French cavalry charges. And then there were the longbowmen, Edward's secret weapon. The English longbow was a revolutionary weapon. It could fire arrows with incredible speed and deadly accuracy, far outranging the French crossbows. Edward knew that if the French charged head-on, the longbowmen would rain destruction down upon them. But would it be enough? As night fell, Edward and his men prepared for battle, knowing that the next day would decide their fate. The French army, vastly outnumbering the English, approached, unaware that they were walking into a trap. Chapter 3, The Longbow, a weapon that changed warfare. The English longbow was more than just a tool of war, it was a game-changer. In the hands of skilled archers, it was a deadly force capable of turning the tide of battle. Unlike the slow, cumbersome crossbow used by the French, the longbow could unleash a deadly hail of arrows at an incredible rate. The longbow had a range of over 300 meters, and its arrows could pierce even the finest armor. At Crécy, the English archers were well-trained, experienced, and prepared for the fight of their lives. They each carried up to 72 arrows, enough for only a few minutes of rapid shooting, but every shot counted. Imagine the terror of the French knights, their heavy armor offering little protection against the relentless onslaught of arrows. Horses were brought down, riders were unseated, and the chaos spread through the ranks of the French army. The longbow was a simple weapon, but it was about to change the course of history. Chapter 4, The Battle Begins. The morning of August 26th dawned with tension in the air. The French army, confident in their overwhelming numbers, prepared to attack. But as they marched into position, the skies opened up. A sudden rainstorm soaked the battlefield, turning the ground into mud. The French crossbowmen, hired mercenaries from Genoa, were the first to engage. But the rain had soaked their bowstrings, weakening their already slow rate of fire. Meanwhile, the English longbowmen stood ready, their bows protected from the elements. As the French crossbowmen struggled to reload, the English archers unleashed their devastating arrows. The French were outmatched, outgunned, and outwitted. The crossbowmen broke ranks, fleeing in terror. But their retreat only caused more chaos. Chapter 5: The English Strike Back. Seeing their crossbowmen retreat, the French cavalry charged, determined to break through the English lines. But what they didn't know was that Edward had prepared for this moment. The muddy terrain, the pits dug by the English, and the relentless fire from the longbowmen turned the French charge into a disaster. The French knights, weighed down by their heavy armor, struggled to move through the muck. Horses were brought down by arrows, and riders were thrown into the chaos. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of men and horses, turning the once proud French charge into a scene of carnage. But the French didn't give up. Again and again, they charged, trying to break through the English defenses. The air was filled with the sounds of clashing steel, the cries of the wounded, and the constant thrum of arrows being fired. Chapter 6: A Night of Horror. As the sun began to set, the battle raged on. The French, unwilling to admit defeat, launched wave after wave of attacks. But each charge met the same fate, broken, scattered, and decimated by the English archers and foot soldiers. One of the most famous moments of the battle came when the blind King John of Bohemia, refusing to sit idly by, tied his horses' reins to those of his knights and charged into battle. Though blind, he fought with courage, but like so many others that day, he fell on the field of Crécy. By midnight, the French army was in complete disarray. Philip VI himself narrowly escaped capture, wounded and demoralized. The French nobility, many of whom had fought valiantly, lay dead on the field. The once mighty army of France had been utterly defeated. Chapter 7: Victory at Crécy. When the dust finally settled, the English had won a stunning and decisive victory. Despite being outnumbered 5-1, Edward III's army had emerged triumphant. The French losses were catastrophic. Thousands of knights, nobles, and soldiers lay dead. Among the fallen were some of the most prominent figures in France, including John of Bohemia and several counts and dukes. In contrast, English casualties were shockingly low. The longbowmen had proven their worth, and the French cavalry had been humbled. Chapter 8: The Legacy of Crécy. The Battle of Crécy was more than just a military victory, it was a revolution in warfare. It marked the end of the era of the invincible knight and the rise of new tactics and technologies. The longbow, in particular, became a symbol of English military superiority. The lessons of Crécy would be remembered for centuries. Future battles, like Agincourt and Poitiers, would see the English longbowmen continue to dominate the battlefield. And for Edward III, Crécy solidified his reputation as one of England's greatest kings. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Crécy was its impact on the future of warfare. It proved that discipline, strategy, and innovation could defeat sheer numbers and brute force. In many ways, the Battle of Crécy was the birth of modern warfare. What happened at Crécy was not just the defeat of one army, it was the end of an era. An era of noble knights charging into battle, invincible in their shining armor. In its place was a new kind of warfare, one where skill and innovation could overcome even the most powerful of forces. The lessons of Crécy are as relevant today as they were in 1346. Who will remember your name? Those who adapt, or those who fall? This was the Battle of Crécy. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to uncover more stories of history's greatest battles and empires.